My paper is a little bit different from the paper we already listened to. It is an impulse for discussion. So I hope that it will incite our reflecting on the topic and afterwards introduce to vivid debates. Protology, cosmology, and Christianity. First of all, I wish to state that reflecting on the origin of the world and interpreting the world as God's creation is not primary in the Bible. Rather, the religion of Israel is based on originating experiences in history. The liberation from Egypt, God's care for the people on its way through the desert, and the transmission of the commandments to Moses on Mount Sinai. It was only when faced with the creation myth of Babylon and in engaging with its deities that the poets of Israel felt compelled to enlarge their vision of God. The God of the Exodus does not only act in history, but at the very beginning of history, he created the world. Later on, in the post-exilic period, Israel was ready to recognize the manifestations of divine omnipotence and wisdom in the order of nature, in the firmament and the mountains, the animals and plants. Especially the creation psalms in the Old Testament bear witness to this new approach to nature, but also the splendid texts of wisdom, some of which were written only later in Hellenistic times. Fundaments of reflecting on the origin of the world and humankind, however, remained the two creation stories in the first chapters of the Bible. We already heard about this. Especially the first chapter, which describes the creation of the world in 6 days, the hexaemeron, became the epitome of biblical protology. Nevertheless, the creation narratives as well as the wisdom text do not exclude the dark side of creation. On the contrary, they point to the evil in nature and among human beings. And they accuse God being responsible for the evil. Is there any justification for unjust suffering in the world? Why do we face injustice and violence nearly everywhere? Why does the wicked enjoy the good? And why suffer the good distress and violence? Isn't God responsible for all that evil? Job passionately accuses God of his alleged injustice. At the end of the book, however, God puts him in his place. Where were you when I founded the earth? This is a question posed to Job. Job is only a creature. The wisdom of God remains unfathomable to him. From its literary origins in the Babylonian exile, the creation of the world was understood as a manifestation of divine omnipotence. In Hebrew, there's a word for this that appears exclusively in text referring to God's creation of the world, bara. The term occurs in the creation narratives in Genesis, the book Genesis, in the so-called Deuteronomy, Jesaja, in Hezekiah, and in the Psalms. It refers to God's sovereignty to bring forth a well-ordered world from the formless primordial substance, the tohu vabohu. Christian scholars will later find a similar idea in Platon's dialogue Timaeus, according to which the master builder of the world, the demiurgos, formed the well-ordered cosmos out of the disordered chaos. Christian theologians frequently identified the Platonic demiurge with the divine logos, in which, according to St. Paul, everything was created. In Hellenistic times, the emphasis on divine omnipotence led to the view that God had not created the world out of chaos, but out of nothing, the creatio ex nihilo idea. Nevertheless, in the first appearance of this idea, Israel's original conviction that God is not primarily creator, but liberator, comes to the fore. For in the relevant texts, The creation of the world is regularly associated with God's power to raise the dead to life. Different from the first chapters of the book of Genesis, the creation psalms, and the wisdom text, the various writing of the New Testament rarely thematize the world as creation. However, creation provides the almost self-evident background for Jesus' preaching of the kingdom of God. Many of Jesus' parables refer to processes in nature. I only refer to the parable of the mustard seed in all three synoptic gospels, and to the parable of the lost sheep in Matthew and Luke. Jesus' healings of the sick reveal the ideal of a healthy creation, both in nature and in social relationships. The Gospels present God's care for all creatures as a model for the Christian attitude toward the world and towards fellow human beings. Early Christian theology is deeply characterized by the conviction that God's creation is good. In the book of Genesis, the predicate is regularly conferred to the works done during each day of creation. On the sixth and last day of creation, God brands the outcome of his work, which finally comprises creating animals and humankind, being very good. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Christian theologians defended the biblical conviction against Gnostics and Christian heretics. These religious groups did not see the world as the work directly created by God himself, but rather as the unhappy byproduct of a fallen deity of minor dignity than the delightful divine origin of all being. In the respective texts, frequently this deity is assigned as demiurgos. Gnostic ideas remained alive in spite of their being opposed by the fathers of the church. They remained alive into the High Middle Ages. Opposing the dualistic sects of the Cathars, the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, this council emphasized the fundamental goodness of creation. Even the devil, the council stresses, initially has been created as good. I quote, "The devil and other demons were indeed created by God good by nature, but they became bad through themselves." End of quotation. Nevertheless, with the mainstream of Christian theology, a tendency towards the spiritualization of the idea of creation can be discerned. I give an example. Irenaeus of Lyon in the second half of the 2nd century regarded man, even in his corporality, as the image of God, referring to the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verse 26 following. 200 years later, Ambrose of Milan localized the image of God only in human spirit and soul. The material world as such is regarded less and less as a place of God's presence. For example, in St. Augustine. The Bishop of Hippo does not expect to gain truth and salvation from the knowledge of nature, but from contemplation and turning to the profundity of human soul. Two very famous quotations. "God and the soul, that is what I desire to know, nothing more." This is a quotation from the beginning of the Soliloquies of St. Augustine. And in De Vera Religione, he says, "Do not look outside, return to yourself. In your interior, the truth resides." I interpret these two verses as an expression of some skepticism and turn away from the goodness of creation as it is stated at the beginning of the book of Genesis. It is evident that this attitude is strongly influenced by the reception of Neoplatonic ideas. We already heard about this in the first contribution. To some instance, the overwhelming reception of Aristotelian philosophy in the Middle Ages corrected Neoplatonic influence. under the influence of the Aristotelian philosophy, the scholastic turned to physical phenomena. An example is Albert the Great. For example, Albert the Great showed a hitherto unknown interest in the objects of nature. Inspired by Aristotle, Albert collected and classified stones, and he wrote an article and tractate on this, De Mineralibus. And he classified animals, De Animalibus. He entitled his writing on this topic. He analyzed the movement of the stars in his famous Speculum Astronomiae. And based on Aristotelian physics, Albert's pupil, Thomas Aquinas, emphasized the independence of the inner worldly laws. God is the first cause of everything, the causa prima. Nevertheless, in the world, secondary causes, the causa secundae, are effective. God's activity in the world, his grace, does not aim at eliminating the secondary causes, but to bring them to power and fruition. Also a very famous quotation, gratia non tollit naturam, sed perficit eam. The grace does not expel or to a certain destroy nature, but makes it perfect. Because the world is God's creation, and certain knowledge of God can be achieved from the analysis of nature. Thus, for example, Aquinas conceives God closely related to the Aristotelian notion of the first cause of every being, and as the universal goal towards which all movement in the world strives to. Thomas can derive his famous proofs of the existence of God from empiricism because he recognizes God's activity in everything, and not like Augustine through everything. Thereby, for Aquinas, it is self-evident that things would immediately fall back into the nothingness from which God created them if the Creator did not preserve them in their being at every moment of their existence. This is a famous creatio continua developed by the scholastic theologians. And this understanding for centuries shaped theology. And this applies across the confessional boundaries that were established and deepened from the 16th century on. Contrary to differences in anthropology, theological questions that were debated among different denominations did not affect creation theology. Only rarely the question was disputed in what sense and to what instance creation and humanity can be grasped as God's image. This was disputed among the Catholic, the Protestant denominations, but usually there were no very intensive debate on this. It is in a certain sense related to the doctrine of justification that was debated. However, with the beginning of the modern era, new challenges arose for the denominations from outside now. These, for example, felt obliged to deny God's revelatory and miraculous intervention in the world. The deists argued that God had created the world perfectly. And just as a watchmaker can only damage a functioning clockwork by intervening later, there's no reason for God to intervene in the world after he had created it from nothing. Contrarily, Christian physico-theologians, this is special term, physical theologians, saw in the wonderful things in nature, of which they now gained increasing knowledge in the age of colonialism. From the things in nature, they gained proofs of God's omnipotence and wisdom. And in this era, different branches of natural theology emerged. The cosmological theories of Copernicus, of Galilei, and Charles Darwin's theory of evolution shook this confidence. The dimension of the universe, which became apparent through astronomical observations, cast doubt on the central position of the Earth. And in the 19th century, a manifest contradiction was seemingly established between the divinely authorized narratives of the Bible and the findings of the natural sciences. This also refers to what he already heard in the first contribution. How could the findings of cosmology and the new insight of Darwin's theory of evolution be reconciled with the biblical teaching of the creation of the world? And not only the age of the world, also the development, the evolution of species, and was debated. Christianity still today is deeply divided on these questions. As late as in 1950, Pope Pius XII felt obliged to insist on the descent of humanity from a single human couple, Adam and Eve. The doctrine of original sin seemed to him to be untenable otherwise. Nevertheless, after the Second Vatican Council, there were signs of an increasing acceptance of the theory of evolution, also on the part of the church teaching authority. Nowadays, among Catholics, there's a strong support for Darwin's theory. And the arguing of the Pope from 1950 is not anymore reminded or quoted. In contrast, data collected in the Darwin year 2009 show that not only Muslims hesitate in accepting the theory of evolution as a viable hypothesis for the origin of life on Earth, within Christianity too, there are numerical significant evangelical groups that insist on a creationist reading of the biblical scriptures. Christian adherents of the intelligent design doctrine have set themselves to the task of identifying phenomena of innovative emergence in nature and high improbability of development as indicators of divine intervention in nature. In doing so, of course, they raise questions that go far beyond the topic of protology. How, for example, can one conceive the relationship between God's eternity and the time of the world? How can God affect from his eternity the time of the world? What is time? What is eternity? If time only began with the creation of the world, must we not conclude then that the world is eternal? However, how could this be reconciled with the biblical teaching that God gave the world a beginning in time? Second question, furthermore, if God is omniscient, in what sense is he related to the knowledge of any individual human being? Is there a difference between God's perception of the world and the individual's perception? How to conceive the difference without lessening God's omniscience? Given that both perceptions, human and divine, are identical, how can one then discern between God and creature? And the third topic, the relationship between human freedom and God's omniscience. Can I really conceive being free if God knows today what I will do tomorrow? St. Augustine, Boethius, Anselm of Canterbury, all these theologians already made great efforts to reflect on this challenge and on the reality of human freedom. Such questions in the Middle Ages frequently have been discussed in close contact with Jewish and Islamic scholars. On the part of the church, the Byzantine scholar John Philoponus should be mentioned. He argued against the Aristotelian doctrine of the eternity of the world. On part of Muslim scholars, Avicenna, Al-Ghazali, and Ibn Rushd should be mentioned. And on part of Jewish scholars, Maimonides. All these profoundly influenced scholastic debates on the eternity of the world. Most of the above-mentioned scholars refer to Aristotle, who had presented compelling reasons in favor of the eternity of the world. I will not develop this arguing here. Perhaps it is already known by the audience. Magisterial condemnations of Averroist positions in the 13th century, these positions had been held at the University of Paris, by no means terminated the ongoing and subtle debates among theologians on the eternity of the world. In late scholasticism, Christian theologians accentuated the absolute power of God And by doing this, the question was raised, why at all did God create the world? John Duns Scott offered an answer that still nowadays is frequently quoted. In Latin, Deus vult con diligentis. God wishes entities or creatures he might love and who might love him. God created the world because he wished to have an addressee. He would be ready to love, and who from its part would be ready to love God. Thus arguing, one might characterize God's act of creation as an act of creatio ex amore. Already for Duns Scotus, the origin of the world is rooted in the primordial difference between God Father and God Son. The Son is a principal addressee of God's love. However, God wished to transcend the boundaries of his own triune nature. Relying on the assumption that humanity is the ultimate target of creation, Karl Rahner expresses this dynamic quite impressively, arguing, I quote, "We could now define humanity as that which ensues when God's self-utterance, his words, is given out lovingly into the void of godless nothing." Quotation from his theological investigations. With regard to the metaphysical implications of creation, the later, I just get the signal that I have to put to ensure the electricity. Just 1 second. So, with regard to metaphysical implications of creation, the later so-called pantheism dispute, which was fought out from 1785 onwards by renowned proponents of the Enlightenment, did affect the Christian view of the world and its relationship to God. The dispute was concentrated on Spinoza's hypothesis that God and nature are identical. The famous quotation is Deus sive natura. It is not literally, cannot be literally found in the scriptures, but it, in a certain sense, it correctly mirrors Spinoza's thought. Spinoza's pivotal question was, if the universe is infinite, how can one discern it from God, who, as the one and single substance, must likewise be conceived as infinite? I will not report the ongoing discussion and debates among Christian theologians on this challenge. For the Catholic Church, the First Vatican Council in 1870 declared definitively that God was really and essentially distinct from the world. In Latin, re et essentia a mundo distinctus. Without naming them explicitly, the council rejected the views of Spinoza and Hegel, who both, although differently, as you know, had argued in favor of an inherent relationship between God and the world. The distinction between God and the world, as it was defined by the council, but also the inherent laws of nature that were increasingly comprehended and conceived by science, incited theologians in the 20th century to speak of the autonomy of earthly realities, the autonomy of earthly realities. The Catholic theologian Romano Guardini, for example, emphasized the worldliness of the world. I hope to have translated this German expression, die Weltlichkeit der Welt, correctly. Similar, Johann Baptist Metz presented a theory of the world. From a Protestant point of view, Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Friedrich Gogarten elaborated theological conception of secularity, which directs to a similar thesis. Other theologians that stress the difference between God and the world. Other theologians, in turn, endeavored to gain a holistic perspective on the world. In particular, the Jesuit theologian Théa de Chardin, who conceived the world in an ongoing dynamism from cosmogenesis via biogenesis and noogenesis to Christogenesis. So there's a close relationship between creation, evolution, and eschatology to a certain sense. The relation of God and the world is also being reconsidered in the various schools of process theology, arguing that God, through the creation of the world, is affected essentially by nature. Thus, God and the world have a common history. I only briefly present all these positions that should be elaborated during writing the paper. In retrospect to Auschwitz, the Jewish philosopher Hans Jonas spoke of the world as a becoming adventure. I see some similarities to this process theology. The world as a becoming, Werdeabenteuer Gottes in German, becoming adventure of God. According to Jonas, God gave up his omnipotence with the creation of the world. Only after, as he puts it, the odyssey of time, will God return to himself, but not, as Jonas puts it, at the bright and self-aware absolute spirit of Hegel, but, I quote, laden with the chance harvest of unpredictable temporal experience, transfigured or perhaps also decreated by it. Evidently, Hans Jonas refers to the Kabbalistic doctrine of Tzimtzum that already mentioned. According to this doctrine, God began the process of creation by contracting his infinity in order to allow for a conceptual space in which finite realms could exist. However, such a conception can hardly satisfy the standards of contemporary metaphysics, I guess. Accordingly, Christian theologians and Jewish scholars have raised serious concerns on Jonas' theory. Furthermore, I'm quite sure that the majority of Muslims will not be ready to follow it. Nevertheless, it will hardly be possible to deny that God, by creating the world, ran a significant risk to himself. Insofar, Jonas' theory points to a dimension of creation that is also debated in recent theology. I skip examples for this. To conclude, the belief that God is the one without whom there is nothing. This is a quotation from the Jesuit theologian Peter Klauer. God is the one without whom there is nothing. And that God is powerful to set the difference between being and nothingness in favor of being. Quotation from the Cologne theologian Hans-Joachim Heim. God is powerful to set the difference between being and nothingness in favor of being. That, I suppose, is something that Jews, Christians, and Muslims are likely to agree. But in what way God has set the difference in favor of being? In what way the relationship between God and the world is to be conceived now when the world does exist remains an intellectual challenge for followers and adherents of all three monotheistic religions. So this is my contribution, and now I expect a vivid debate discussion on my proposal. Thank you.